Keep curious. JustProfessor here. You hear that someone failed a drug test, and you immediately assume they use drugs. You hear that a test detected cancer, and you panic thinking you definitely have cancer. But you're ignoring the most important piece of information, how common these things actually are. And this mistake is making you wrong about almost everything involving probability. Here's a classic problem. A test for a rare disease is 95% accurate. You take the test, and it comes back positive. What are the chances you actually have the disease? Most people say 95%, but that's completely wrong. If the disease affects 1 in 1,000 people, even with a 95% accurate test, your chances of actually having it after a positive result might only be around 2%. Why? Because you ignored the base rate. How common the disease is in the first place. This is base rate neglect, and it's making you misunderstand risk, probability, and what information actually means. Base rate neglect is when you ignore general statistical information about how common something is, and instead focus only on specific information about an individual case. You hear information about a particular person or situation, and you make judgments without considering how frequent or rare that situation is overall. The base rate is the starting probability before you get any specific information, and your brain constantly ignores it. This happens because specific information feels more relevant and real than abstract statistics. Someone tells you this person did this thing, and your brain focuses on that specific case. The general statistics about how often that thing happens feel less important, even though mathematically they're crucial. Your brain prefers concrete examples over abstract numbers. The problem is, this makes you terrible at understanding what information actually tells you. A positive test result does not mean what you think it means if you ignore how rare the condition is. Someone fitting a profile does not mean what you think if you ignore how many people fit that profile. Evidence that seems strong is actually weak if you factor in the base rates you're neglecting. Let me give you more examples to make this clear. Medical testing is full of base rate neglect. Imagine a disease affects 1% of people. A test for it is 90% accurate. It correctly identifies 90% of people who have it, and correctly identifies 90% of people who don't have it. You test positive. Should you panic? Most people would panic because they think there's a 90% chance they have the disease. But let's actually calculate using base rates. In a population of 10,000 people, 100 actually have the disease. The test correctly identifies 90 of them as positive. But 9,900 people don't have the disease, and the test incorrectly identifies 10% of them as positive. That is 990 false positives. So, out of 10,000 people, you get 90 true positives and 990 false positives. If you test positive, you're way more likely to be one of the false positives than a true positive because the disease is so rare. The base rate completely changes what the test result means. Criminal profiling suffers from base rate neglect. Police might say someone fits the profile of a criminal. They're male, young, in a certain neighborhood, wearing certain clothes. But even if 90% of criminals fit this profile, if only 1 in 1,000 people in that profile are actually criminals, then seeing someone who fits the profile doesn't tell you much. You're way more likely to be looking at an innocent person who happens to fit the profile than an actual criminal, because the base rate of criminals is so low. Fraud detection has this problem. A fraud detection algorithm flags your transaction as suspicious. You might think this means you were probably hacked. But if fraud is rare, low base rate, and the algorithm has a 5% false positive rate, then most flagged transactions are actually legitimate. The specific information that your transaction was flagged feels important, but the base rate of how rare fraud actually is matters more. Job interviews show this. Someone interviews really well. The interviewer thinks they'll be a great employee based on the interview. But if the interview only predicts job performance 55% of the time, and you're ignoring the base rate that maybe only 30% of candidates would be good at the job, then your confidence in the candidate based on the interview is probably way too high. Eyewitness identification demonstrates base rate neglect dangerously. A witness identifies someone from a lineup. That seems like strong evidence. But if the lineup has 6 people and the witness is just guessing, they have a 1 in 6 chance of identifying anyone by random chance. If the base rate of guilty suspects in lineups is relatively low, then an identification might not be as meaningful as it seems. You need to factor in how often innocent people get identified by mistake. Startup success stories make people neglect base rates constantly. Someone hears about a startup that succeeded by taking a huge risk or ignoring conventional wisdom. They think, I should do that too. But they're ignoring the base rate that most startups fail. For every success story you hear about someone who took a big risk and won, there are hundreds who took similar risks and lost everything. The specific story feels compelling, but the base rate of failure is what you should actually be considering. Viral success stories do this too. Someone posts a video that goes viral. People think they can replicate it, but they're ignoring the base rate that most content doesn't go viral. The specific example of success is memorable and feels achievable, but the statistics say it's incredibly rare. Sports predictions fall into this trap. Someone has a hot streak and people predict continued success. But they're ignoring regression to the mean and the base rate that extreme performances usually do not continue. The specific recent performance feels more important than the general statistics about typical performance levels. So, how do you avoid base rate neglect? How do you factor in base rates when making judgments? First, always ask about base rates explicitly. When you get specific information about a case, stop and ask, how common is this thing in general? Before you react to a positive test, ask how common the condition is. Before you judge someone based on a profile, ask what percentage of people who fit that profile have the quality you're judging. Making base rates explicit forces your brain to consider them. Second, do the math. Actually calculate probabilities using base rates instead of going with your gut feeling. Your intuition will ignore base rates, but the math won't. When you work through problems with actual numbers like in the medical test example, you see how crucial base rates are. Third, think in terms of natural frequencies instead of percentages. Instead of 95% accurate, think out of 1,000 people how many true positives and how many false positives will there be. This concrete framing makes base rates more obvious and harder to ignore. Fourth, be skeptical of judgments based on specific information. When someone presents you with evidence about an individual case, remember that specific information can be misleading if you don't know the base rates. Ask yourself what you're not being told about how common or rare this situation is overall. Fifth, look up actual statistics. Don't rely on your intuition about how common things are. Your sense of base rates is probably wrong because rare dramatic things are more memorable than common mundane things. Look up actual data about prevalence, frequency, and probability. Sixth, remember that specificity doesn't equal reliability. Detailed, specific information feels more trustworthy than vague statistics, but specific information is meaningless without base rate context. A detailed profile or test result tells you less than you think if you ignore how common false matches are. Seventh, beware of stories that ignore base rates. When someone tells you a compelling story about an exception or an unusual case, remember that exceptions are memorable precisely because they're rare. The base rate is that most cases aren't like the memorable exception. Base rate neglect is making you misunderstand probability constantly. You focus on specific information while ignoring the general statistical context that determines what that specific information actually means. A positive test, a matching profile, a successful case, impressive performance. None of these mean what you think they mean if you don't factor in how common or rare the underlying condition is. This affects medical decisions, legal judgments, hiring, predictions, risk assessment, and basically any situation where you're trying to figure out probability or make decisions under uncertainty. Your brain wants to focus on the specific and concrete while ignoring the abstract statistics. but the statistics are what actually matter for accurate judgment. Understanding base rates doesn't just make you better at math problems. It changes how you interpret information in real life. That positive test might not be as scary as you think. That suspicious behavior might not be as meaningful as it seems. That success story might not be as replicable as you hope. Base rates give you context that transforms what information actually tells you. The next time someone gives you specific information that seems important, stop and ask about base rates. How common is this thing in general? What percentage of people who show this sign actually have the condition? How often does this kind of success actually happen? Without base rate information, specific information can be completely misleading. Your brain will keep wanting to ignore base rates because they're abstract and boring while specific cases are concrete and interesting. But base rates are the foundation of accurate probability judgment. Specific information matters, but only in the context of base rates. Learn to think about both together instead of letting specific information override statistical reality. Subscribe to discover more probability biases making you misunderstand risk and evidence.